What's up, everybody? Welcome back. We are here with some more DraftKings MMA DFS picks and lineup advice. Also, some FanDuel tips, sleepers, best bets, everything you need for UFC Mexico. We have two main events. We have Brandon Moreno and Brandon Royval. We have Yair Rodriguez and Brian Ortega. And if you think to yourself, wow, those matchups sound familiar, yes, because they both have literally fought each other already. And we're getting the rematches down here in Mexico. Welcome. I am Brian Jester, co-founder here at Occupy Fantasy, joined by owner of MMADFS.com, Jake the Snake. Jake, what's up, man? Let's bring it out in the open. Volk didn't look great last week, but we own our losses. And for the people who think we're gonna get every single pick right, it's just not gonna happen.
Yeah, that was a rough one, man. The only bright side of that is that slate was so fucked up anyways, because every single favorite won that it didn't even matter at that point if Volk won. Although I guess if every single underdog loses, then nah, it would have been stupid. It would
Yep.
have been it would have been maxing salary and like jamming Woodburn. But nah, that was a rough one. I'll take the credit or the punishment for going that heavily on Volk. But man, I didn't think he looked that great, man. I know he was winning, but I thought he looked off from the beginning. I was like, he's not like moving back well. He's not avoiding contact well. Like I just had a bad feeling from the start. I was like, he looks off, man. We're in trouble.
It's one of those fights where you wish you could change your bet or your allocation within 10 seconds of.
Yeah,
Uh, and it's always funny. Like we'll get into the fights here in a second, but whenever my mom bets on football, and she always says with some quarterbacks that are hit or miss, she always says if I could just watch them for one drive, then I would know
right.
which way I need. And I've tried to explain the concept of live betting, but it's not gotten through to her yet. So, anyways, let's talk about UFC Mexico, right? We have 13 fights on the card, two 5 rounders, right? The Yair Rodriguez Brian Ortega fight is also a 5 round fight, so that changes the dynamic a little bit. So, what we'll do in this video, we will discuss the 5 round strategies. We'll break down the main events. We'll talk about the one newcomer on the card. We'll discuss the 1 million fighters that have less than 4 fights under their belt on their resume, and we'll discuss a little bit of context to their fight logs. Then we'll give you a fight that you have to target in DFS, our favorite underdog fantasy play stat of the slate, and our stream parlay of the week. And let's jump into it. So, Jake, 13 fights, which is nice when you have two 5 rounders. It does give a little more options for us to be different. But generally, what is the strategy for two 5 round fights on a 13 fight card? And again, we can keep this kind of brief, just from a high level. What is the optimal strategy, whether it's low risk contests or high risk contests, that our viewers should be looking to utilize in their contests?
Yeah, I mean, pretty simple. We've been tracking this for a while. So you basically always want to play 1 to 2 5 round fighters in your high risk contest lineups. And one has been the best strategy in terms of being the most profitable long term. So looking at the last 19 slates, there was only one instance where we had 0 5 round fighters in the winner. There was 8 where exactly one were in the winner, and there was 10 where 2 were in the winner. But on those 10 lineups, the average split was 14. On the 8 lineups, it goes all the way down to 4.5. So you're making way more money when it's just one. And they've been going back and forth. At one point, just one had happened more often, and then 2 hit a few times. So I mean, either way, it's pretty close in terms of which one wins more often. But you win way more money when you just play one, and it's way easier to get unique. So that's the optimal strategy. If you want to do 2, find ways to get unique in the rest of your lineup, whether it's leaving salary, playing low owned fighters. But it's much easier to create unique lineups if you just play one. And from a low risk standpoint, you want to play 3. You want to stack one of the 2 fights and then play just one of the fighters from the other fight. And on this one, I like leaving out Ortega personally. The guy hasn't fought in forever. Royval has shown that he can score well even in a loss. So yeah, I mean, I think you want to play both favorites and then pick your favorite underdog. But for me, it's going to be Royval, who's cheaper than Ortega, opposed to the guy that is coming off the shoulder injury and hasn't fought in like a year and a half, 2 years, and has really gotten beaten up in a couple of his recent fights. So yeah, I think it's pretty straightforward.
And do you think the field, and just for those viewers who aren't familiar with our terminology, when we say low risk contests, we're referring to double ups, 50-50s, head to heads, those specifically. And again, this is DraftKings specific strategy. It looks like, Jake, just looking at around the industry, I think, and just from what we know from previous 2 5-round fight slates that the field does play all 4 fighters pretty heavily, usually in low risk contests.
Yeah, I mean, it seems pretty common, especially on a slate like this where you have some other value. If you play all four, you don't have to play any other underdogs, and you can play, you can play Torres and Charres in the 4 5 round fighters, which is, that is a pretty solid lineup. So it's like it's hard to argue, avoiding all 3 round underdogs. So I think a lot of people are going to play that.
Absolutely. And when we talk about small field GPPs, less than 500 players, really the optimal strategy is just playing 2 5-round fighters, don't stack. You don't have to get cute enough to where you can leave one in and leave out the other fight. Just play 2. You're almost guaranteeing yourself 90 plus points in 2 spots, which you can't really say about any other spots in your lineup with 3-round fights. So just play 2 in small field GPPs. And if you are playing the larger contests, if you're hand building, yeah, maybe you go with just the one fighter strategy. But Jake, if you're like you and I, we mass multi-enter. I personally am going to allow 2 5-round fighters in specific lineups, but I'll just have rules created around that. Sure, you could go all in on just one 5-round fighter in your 20 or 150 lineups, but I think if you're just careful with the rules, especially if you use our builder, I think there are very easy and creative ways to get different. Just be cognizant of which fighters used in your lineups, right?
Right, and especially on this slate where pricing's pretty loose, you can play 2 5 round fighters and just leave some salary and avoid playing Torres in those lineups. So I think they're pretty easy rules to make. Where yeah, you don't have to go all in on one side, and because if you go all in on one side, then you're immediately screwed if that doesn't hit. Whereas at least you're live if you play both sides and create some rules to just try to get unique on whichever way you go.
For sure. And you've mentioned Manuel Torres a couple of times now. And just for those of you playing on DraftKings, Torres is 8,300. He opened at minus 115, right, Jake? And now he's up to minus 200. Just from a money line win probability perspective and ownership perspective, he's a guy that it's really a blocking mechanism in low risk contests. Even if we're not personally high on Torres in this particular spot, it's a spot, Jake, that even if he loses, he won't kill you. And if he does win, and especially if he gets a finish, you're almost drawing dead in low risk contests if you don't have him on DraftKings.
Right, and if you're like me and you're trying to go underweight in tournaments, then it's also a decent hedge there.
Absolutely. And some of you may be asking, what's the best way to find out if a fighter is underpriced? You could go manually, go sportsbook to sportsbook, but you could go to one of our sites. I know Jake has the sheet on his site. You could go to our model, which I'll bring up really quickly. You can just sort by DraftKings salary or FanDuel salary, look at the money lines and see which one stands out. You'll see that Torres minus 200 as the last time the model was pulled. Bondar below him is minus 109. Mendonca above him is minus 118. To get a higher money line than Torres, you have to go all the way up to Ziem at $8,700. So that lets you know if someone is mispriced, and you can do the same thing the opposite way if someone is overpriced. So that gives you a pretty good indication of who will be popular in low risk contests. And before we break down the main events, Jake, just really quickly, FanDuel dropped the ball and they priced the Rodriguez Ortega fight as if it was a 3-rounder. So that looks like an easy stack in low risk contests, which is something we don't normally say about FanDuel pricing.
Yeah, yeah, right. Low risk is completely different on the two slates because they didn't price up either fighter on FanDuel. So yeah, you actually do want to stack Yair Ortega and then play Moreno to start your low risk lineups on FanDuel.
Cool. All right, guys. So that's a lot more strategy than we generally discuss here at the beginning. So let's get into the fights themselves. And we'll start with, I guess, the headliner here, Moreno and Royval, Jake. And we can keep this pretty brief, right? We've seen these fights before. We know enough about these fighters, enough tape, enough stats. We pretty much know what to expect from these fights. But we'll start Moreno, Royval. How do you think it plays out? And then for tournaments, what do you think is the best strategy here?
Yeah, I mean, like you said, we've seen them fight once. That fight only lasted a round before Royval suffered a shoulder injury, but we did see Moreno control him on the mat, which just goes to show that Brandon Royval continues to have pretty bad wrestling. We've seen him get out wrestled by basically anyone that knows how to wrestle. Royval has just a 40% takedown defense. He trains at Factory X Muay Thai. That's not the ideal place to learn how to wrestle, and he's been there forever. So he's not the type of guy that goes around and goes to a bunch of different gyms, learns from different people. He just stays at Factory X, small group of guys. He's lived there. He's lived in Colorado forever. The guy would really, in my opinion, be well served to go somewhere like AT&T and go to a different gym and train with a bunch of wrestlers in his own weight class. He just doesn't have good wrestling. I mean, I love Brandon Royval. Who doesn't love Brandon Royval? He's a fun guy. Like, he seems like definitely like a good person, and he's fun to watch. Good submissions, super high paced, like just crazy, crazy fights basically in all of his fights, except for the fact that he gets controlled way too much. And we already saw that happen once against Moreno, and that was a few years ago. But I think Moreno has actually gotten better since then. And Royval, yeah, he's had some more experience, but I think he's basically the same fighter. Maybe with a shoulder that doesn't pop out of socket as much at this point, but it just seems like a tough matchup for Royval. We really saw him struggle against Pantoja. Pantoja just completely dominated that fight on the mat. And yeah, Pantoja also beat Moreno on the mat, but not quite as dominant. That was a split decision, which I still think that was like a 49-46 decision, but whatever. I mean, I'm not going to get into that. I think there's a clear hierarchy in the division. It's Pantoja, then Moreno, then Royval, and it's almost like the Adesanya Whitaker. It's like these guys could fight like 10 times, and we're probably going to see the same result just every time. So I think it's a good DFS matchup for Moreno. We get the pace up Royval, we get the struggling wrestling of Royval. So I think Moreno is going to be able to fill up the stat sheet here. He's landed like 3 straight third round finishes. Well, not 3 straight, but in his last 3 wins, they were all third round finishes, which obviously isn't ideal. He was scoring like 99 points, 80 points, 97 points, and he was scoring more when he was able to wrestle. But I think this is finally a spot where we could actually see him put up a better score, because it seems like Moreno basically is always that guy that underperforms and can never justify a really high price tag. But I do think this is the one spot where he can finally score, 110, 120 points potentially, whether it's, probably a decision, I would say. I don't really think he finishes Royval, but it's not impossible. Moreno has actually, been finishing people, which it seems like he's a decision guy, but he has been getting finishes lately. And he's got the home crowd behind him. He's fighting in Mexico City. I think he's going to be amped up. He lost the last 2 times he fought in Mexico City. He's been on the last 2 Mexico City cards. So he's super familiar with the spot, with the elevation, with everything that goes into fighting there. And I think he's really going to be looking to put a stamp and try to get another title shot, because that Pantoja fight was close. And if it's not Moreno, like, who's it going to be? Are they going to try to build up Mikhaev? Like, there just aren't that many guys right now. Kopp missed weight for his last fight. Like, it's tough. They're trying to find a spot for Pantoja, and they just pulled Alex Pereira off that Brazil card. So I think they're going to want Pantoja to headline it. So they might try to do a quick turnaround for Moreno. We'll see. But, that's another conversation for another day. Either way, good high upside spot for Moreno. I think it's a pretty safe floor, even though Royval is a dangerous grappler. Moreno's a black belt. I think it's going to be hard to finish Moreno. So high floor, high ceiling spot for Moreno, and just a tough spot for Royval. But he did show he scored 90 points in his recent loss, which is why I want to stack this fight in low risk, but also shows that, like, he does have a high floor when he's not getting finished, because he's constantly landing strikes, throwing a volume, squirming from the bottom, throwing up submissions. Like, he never stops moving. He's got endless cardio, and I think he'll still be okay. I know Mexico City's like 50% higher than Denver, but I don't know. It seems like Royval's just one of these guys that never gets tired. So I think he'll be able to handle the elevation okay, even though he did his preparation in Denver and he didn't go down super early to Mexico City. We'll see. There's always a chance that it could affect him, but I think he'll be all right. But yeah, I think Moreno's the play here.
And just really quickly, what do you have on the ownership for these guys on DraftKings?
Neither guy is that high, which makes it more of an interesting spot. So Moreno's only at 36% and Royval's only at 26%. So 62 combined percent ownership is pretty low for a main event.
It is, absolutely. And you mentioned the elevation a couple of times. So Mexico City, obviously, extremely high elevation. And again, you don't have to go super deep here, but did that affect how you were making your picks, how you may change your DFS lineups, some of your bets that you put out for your subscribers at MMADFS.com? Did elevation play into that at all?
Yeah, absolutely. The first thing I did this week was go on to like Instagram and go look at every single fighter on the card and see where they've been training lately, see who went down early, who didn't. Mexico City is like 7,400 feet above sea level. Denver's like 5,200 feet or something. Salt Lake City's lower than that. Salt Lake City is like 4,800. And we saw people get destroyed from the elevation in Salt Lake City. And maybe the issue with Salt Lake City is people were taking it for granted. Like, oh, it's not even as high as Denver. I don't know. That's one possibility. Like, just maybe they weren't preparing the way that people are preparing for this Mexico City card. But whether it's the NFL, whether it's MMA, we've seen sporting events in Mexico City. Even like soccer, we've seen sporting events where elevation plays a factor, and the pollution of Mexico City, which you're going to hear everyone talking about it, which, like, from a contrarian's perspective, you kind of want to be like, oh, everyone's talking about it, so I'm going to like put less stock into it. But I think it will play a factor. I think you're going to see people get tired. And it doesn't necessarily mean like, oh, you're going to see way more finishes, because both sides of a fight may get tired.
Right.
Like, you can't simplify it down to like, oh, one guy's going to gas, so the other guy's going to like kill it. Like, I think you have to look at it a little more deeply. But yes, I do think elevation is going to play a factor. And I think the people that got there early will have an edge on the people that just showed up late. And in general, it seems like all the Brazilian guys got there really late. They train in Sao Paulo, which is like, yeah, it's like 2,600 feet above sea level, but it's nowhere close to Mexico City. And I feel like they sort of took it for granted. So we'll see, man. I'm a little nervous on all the Brazilian guys because three of them were from Shoot Box and they all came together. And the other was Rayoni Barcelos, who's getting really old, and we've seen him tire out even not at elevation. So, yeah, I do think it will play a factor.
As a fellow old, I must say the cardio does not improve with age, as I found out very recently. So prayers up for Barcelos here. So all right, moving on. Let's talk about Yair and Ortega. Last time we saw these guys fight, Yair finished him in the first round. Technically a finish. Ortega's shoulder arm popped out. So now they're rematching again. Ortega has not fought since then. So how do you see this fight playing out? How do you see ownership breaking down and what it means for tournaments?
Yeah, so Yair's 31 years old, coming off the title fight loss to Volk. Has historically struggled to score well in decisions. He's never scored more than 82 points in a 3-round decision, and the one time he won a 5-round decision, he only scored 85 points, which isn't ideal. But then you look at Ortega, who averages 6.66 significant strikes absorbed per minute. And that's definitely what you want to target. We've seen guys just completely go off on Ortega, whether it was Max Holloway, Volkanovski. We've seen people just really, put up huge numbers against Ortega in the past. So I think it is a guy to target. And then you look at the fact that he hasn't fought since July 2022, and these guys have already fought before. I do think it's a better matchup for Yair than some of his matchups in the past where he struggled. And he's not super expensive. He comes in at 8,500 on DraftKings and only $16 on FanDuel. So he doesn't need to put up a completely massive score to be useful here. And I do think he's going to have a big advantage on the feet. And I mean, we even saw on the mat, like everyone going into that last fight was like, okay, Ortega has a chance to sub him. Then the fight goes to the ground and it's Yair who's throwing up an armbar. And yeah, that was like a freak injury, but it was still Yair threatening positions on the mat. And Ortega went 1 for 5 on his takedown attempts in the first round of that fight. So it's not like he was just killing him in the wrestling. And now you have Ortega who's coming off the long layoff. It sounds like he was kind of questioning if he wanted to retire. He says he's feeling 60 years old. He was talking about like, yeah, it's his way to make money and provide for his family. Like,
Always a good sign.
It wasn't super encouraging listening to him, where he wasn't like, yeah, I'm going to be champion, I'm so excited to fight. He was like, I need to do this, basically. So I don't know, man. I'm pretty concerned. Ortega's gone 1-3 in his last 4 fights. His last win was in 2020 against the Korean Zombie, who just had a rough end to his career. Ortega's second most recent win was in 2018 against Frankie Edgar. Like, this dude has really been struggling with activity and putting wins together. He kind of had that like dead cat bounce after the Holloway loss in the Korean Zombie fight. Then he lost 2 more fights. I don't know, man. He might be the oldest 32-year-old on the roster. He's a good grappler. We saw him almost submit Volk. He scored well in his last 2 wins, but Yair's never been submitted in his career. So I don't think that Yair's like an easy guy to submit. We've seen Yair knocked out a few times, but I think it's a tough matchup for Ortega, and he's probably going to come in with some ring rust. If he wins, at his cheaper price tag, he would probably end up in the winner. So it's kind of winning you're in on him. But I think it's a tough spot for him to win.
And what's the ownership you have on these guys on DraftKings?
So similar to the other fight, Yair is a little bit higher, 39%, Ortega's 30%. So I think the fact that we have 2 5-round fights and the favorites in both of them historically haven't always put up big scores, it kind of spreads out the ownership and keeps anyone from being too highly owned. So that's actually kind of nice for tournaments, is we're not going to have these 50% guys that make it really hard to get unique.
Exactly. All right, let's move on and let's talk about the one debuting fighter on the card. Remember, we're going to talk about the debuters, fighters that have less than 4 fights, and then fight the target, underdog play of the week, and our stream parlay. And if we start with Rodriguez here, aka Lazy Boy, aka Luis, depending on where you look. But Ronaldo Rodriguez making his debut. What's his fighting style, his strength of schedule, and his outlook here against Dennis Bondar in his debut?
Yeah, so we got Luis Ronaldo, Lazy Boy Rodriguez, 24-year-old guy, 16-2 with 11 finishes. The first thing that stood out when I looked at this guy is I'm like, oh, is he coming off Contender Series? No. Oh, he was on Contender Series in 2020. Oh, he lost the decision to Jerome Rivera?
Yeah.
Ouch. Obviously, Jerome Rivera went on to go 0-4 in the UFC and just got finished by basically everyone. Not a great sign for Rodriguez, but you kind of give the guy a break from the standpoint that he was 21 years old at the time when he was cutting down to 125 pounds for the first time in his career, which obviously is tough for a guy that normally fights at 135. And then after that loss, he went back up to 135. And then what I really thought was interesting is in his last two fights at 135, he actually missed weight. And the last fight, he missed weight kind of bad. So I was worried that he was even going to make it like to the scales or make weight. But he actually did. He showed up on weight. He looks super skinny. But I guess he's a young guy, so he'll probably be able to bounce back. I don't know. I mean, those dramatic weight cuts are never ideal, but he made it, which was already surprising me. But in terms of his style, kind of a showboater. Like he's fairly well rounded. He can grapple. He's got decent takedown defense. He's got good striking and quick hands, but he doesn't throw enough volume to get me excited in DFS. He's kind of content with like sporadic actions and kind of showboating at times and kind of just showing off opposed to focusing on striking and finishing. I don't know. It seems like a guy that's probably going to be able to win some decisions, but not going to put up big scores in those wins.
Yeah, that was my first thought as well. And generally, those flashier styles aren't the best for DFS at all. And I believe my sentence to you earlier in the week was this may be the flashiest, worst fight possible with Bondar and Rodriguez. We can see a lot of showboating, a lot of toning, a lot of periods of inactivity. But again, as we all know, debuts, lights on in your home city. Things can change. He can come out and be aggressive. And again, we love uncertainty more than we love knowing what a fighter is going to do. So while we project him to do what he has done, it's not a guarantee that he's going to continue to do that, especially under these circumstances. So now let's play good fighter, bad fighter, good matchup, bad matchup. And this is a brief segment where I just name the fighter who has less than 4 fights in the UFC. Jake tells me, are they good or bad? And is this a good or bad matchup for this UFC Mexico slate? And again, we will start with the first fight of the night until the last fight of the night. In the first fight, we have 2 guys who meet this criteria. We have Muhammad Naimov and Eric Silva. Good or bad? Good or bad?
I think both guys are bad here. I think Naimov is somehow 2-0 in the UFC, which is remarkable considering he took a short notice debut up a weight class and was losing his fight against Jamie Malarkey. Then lands like Jamie Malarkey goes headfirst into a punch, gets knocked out, and then he fights Nathaniel Wood. And I forget what I counted, like 6, 10 fouls or something in that fight, like 3 low blows, a couple fence grabs, a glove grab. Like Naimov almost got knocked out like multiple points in the fight. Somehow wins that fight, didn't get a point deducted, and that's a huge win over Nathaniel Wood. So now he's this massive favorite after he was a massive underdog in both of those wins for the record. Like this guy, like no one was giving him a chance to win either fight. Pulls off back-to-back upsets. Now he comes in, open the week at negative 275. He's negative 650 now. Like the line move on this guy is absolutely insane. And it's probably because Eric Silva hasn't fought in a while, looked terrible in his debut, trains at some tiny gym in Costa Rica that seems like it's more focused on like children's programs than adult actual UFC training. I don't know, man. This is like one of those random fights where both guys are bad. So it's I guess, a good matchup for both of them just based on the fact that the other guy is bad. Yeah, I don't think either guy is good though.
If I could share the DMs between Jake and I, between me and Jake, on how much he does not believe in Naimov this week. I don't think you'd be surprised based on what he just said. I don't think Jake believes he should be minus 600. And I know you and I were both disappointed in Silva's debut. But we like to target fighters in their second fight in the UFC. As I just said, things can happen in their debut. Either way, it seems like a live underdog, especially if both guys are considered bad. Next, we have Felipe Dos Santos, who's up against Morano here. And Dos Santos looked incredible, right, given the circumstances in his short notice debut against Manel Kopp. Now he comes in as a pretty significant favorite despite losing that debut. So is he good or bad? Is he as good as he looked in his debut? And how's this matchup with Morano?
It's hard to describe Dos Santos as good or bad because he has really good offense and absolutely terrible defense. So he's a high upside fighter in DFS. It's going to be hard for him to make a run in the UFC until he like shores up his takedown defense and striking defense. Because right now he just relies on his toughness. He just goes in and just swings. He can't defend a takedown. He gets punched in the face a ton. I mean, Cop stumbled or knocked him down multiple points in that fight. We just had such low expectations coming in that
True.
we are like, oh man, this guy's hanging with Manel Cop. Like he's looking good. He won the third round. He hurt Cop in round 3. And Santos is like, he's got good size at flyweight and he is a good striker and he will mix in a bunch of takedown attempts, but his takedown attempts are basically tackles. He's not doing anything in the mat with them. But that's great for DFS because get the takedown, guy comes back up, take him down again, gets back up, strikes some more, take him down. You know, it's like, it's great for DFS. And we're going to be targeting all of his fights, regardless of whether he's actually good or bad. He's going to be good for DFS for both him and his opponent. Victor Altamirano has had his ups and downs, but he's a smart fighter. I guess we're not, he's had 4 fights, so we're not technically doing him, but I think he's good and it's a good matchup for him. And I think it's probably a good matchup for Dos Santos, just based on Altamirano not being like super dangerous. So the fact that Dos Santos like gets hit a lot, I don't think he's going to get knocked out, but he might get taken down a bunch here. We saw Altamirano attempt 22 takedowns against Salvador, which Dos Santos, I've charted him as a 23% takedown defense, which is significantly lower than your normal fighter.
Yeah. It's funny. I think definitely the market and sometimes even us as analysts or DFS players can overvalue guys who overperform in their debut in a loss, right? And I'm not comparing him to Chris Moutinho, right? Not at all, right? Definitely not in fighting styles. But remember, short notice debut against O'Malley. Everyone was like, holy shit, this guy fared decently well against O'Malley despite getting punched 300 times. And then he came in as a favorite in his next fight, got immediately knocked out and cuffed in the UFC. Again, not saying this will happen with Dos Santos, Jake, but we do see expectations when they're exceeded. Sometimes we can see a little bit of an inflation in their following fight.
Yeah, you get that elastic rubber band effect where you're so low on someone that they exceed your expectations just by being decent, but
Yeah.
then you think they're great and you overvalue them in their second fight.
Yeah, exactly. All right, moving on. We've already talked about Rodriguez, and he is up against Bandar, who came into the UFC with a very questionable record and was somewhat highly touted. Has lost both of his fights in the UFC. Is he actually good or bad? And what do you think with this matchup with Rodriguez?
Anytime you can get a guy where his record changes by like 5 fights every time you look at it, it's not a good sign. Like depending on where you look, Bondar is
Yeah.
either 14-4 or 19-4, and last fight he was 16-4. I mean, they're just all over the place with his fights, and it's because he was fighting his whole career in Ukraine, and a lot of those fights are just like really poorly documented against a really low level of competition, which makes it hard to evaluate these guys when they're coming in. Like Bondar looked like a DFS goldmine when he was coming into the UFC because he was taking everyone down, submitting everyone, putting up huge like takedown and striking totals. Then he immediately breaks his arm against Malcolm Gordon, and then he just doesn't wrestle for some reason very much in his last fight, despite having a great matchup to wrestle against Carlos Hernandez, and then gets violently knocked out on a slam that then they rule was an accidental clash of heads, so it goes down as a technical decision. It doesn't show up as a knockout, but technically he's been finished in both of his UFC fights. So I think he seems pretty fraudulent. I'm not going to call him like a Victor Rodriguez or something. He looked like he's making improvements. He was training at Jackson Wink, but he definitely seems kind of fragile. He's fighting a lot at 135. Now he's at 125. So, maybe that's affecting his durability. But theoretically, he can grapple. But it's a bad matchup for Bondar because Rodriguez has shown a good takedown defense. He's shown he's pretty decent on the mat. He's shown he's hard to hit and has pretty good striking. So I think I'm calling Bondar a bad fighter and a bad matchup.
That's fair enough. Next, we have we've talked about this matchup once because it happened, and then there was a no contest, and then it got canceled again, I believe, with the Silva, Lacerda, and Edgar Shires. Now they're fighting again. Shires, both these guys missed weight today. Shires, I don't even know if he tried. He showed up 131, right, like 5 pounds over the limit. For the seemingly 5th time, is this a good or bad matchup for Shires? I assume it is with Lacerda. Is he good or bad? But I think really, Jake, the question here is, right, we saw nearly a full round of action, and it was much slower pace before the no contest. Is there a chance that, and I think you and I even talked about this when we previewed that slate in a video, like, is there a chance Lacerda, who got finished by everyone, is he like, all right, let me just slow it down a little bit, try to preserve, and maybe that actually kills some of his DFS gold mine?
For sure, man. I mean, we did see it in that fight. He slowed it down a bunch. He was landing some takedowns in control time. We didn't see that crazy pace where he was just unloading on the feet. So that last fight, yeah, it slowed down a lot. And then they were scheduled to fight 4 weeks later, and he dropped out of that because that's what he does. And now they're scheduled to fight again, and both guys tried to like screw up the fight by missing weight. And the UFC is like, no, you guys are fighting. Like, fuck this. Like, it's happening right now. I don't care how much weight you miss by. We're fighting, and this is it. Like, and we're not going to stop it. If you get choked out and die, we're not stopping it early. We're not going to risk whatever to do the reffing. Like, man, it's just a complete disaster, nightmare, like, of a matchup. But I do think in these rematches, they historically underperform in the rematch. And now I don't know if you want to call this the third time. They didn't actually fight the second time, but they've prepared for each other so many times that they have to be super familiar. I think it's going to be really interesting to see if Charr goes for another guillotine or if he's just going to like, nah, screw that, and he tries to pound him out on the mat. Because if he goes for another guillotine, it's really easy for him to bust at his high price tag. Like, he would have scored like 95 DraftKings points in a first round submission last time, which, that's not enough for a $9,300 fighter. And it was lower volume. So if it goes to round 2 and he gets the guillotine, I mean, that's even worse. So it has to be higher volume, or it has to be one of those finishes like we've seen from De Silva in the past, where he's on the mat and he absorbs 300 ground strikes and then the guy scores 150 points. So I think there's a lot of ways for this fight to bust. And it's still not impossible that De Silva wins a UFC fight eventually. We've seen Charr struggle, get put on his back, not be great at getting back up because he's so content with going for guillotines. So I'm not picking De Silva, but I mean, the guy's still theoretically dangerous, and the UFC is going to give him 900 shots to win a fight. And eventually, I mean, he's probably going to win one. Like, I mean, blind squirrel is eventually going to find a nut.
I mean, $6,900. You would think he'd be somewhat popular, right? But I was kind of shocked at his inside the distance numbers. I think they're much lower than what they were the first time these guys fought, if I'm not mistaken. So we might even get him at lower ownership than we got the first time. And I think he was higher owned than we expected. So again, that rubber band effect you were mentioning.
Yeah, man, Charez was like a negative 250 favorite when they rescheduled it the last time. Like, not the first time, but when it was rescheduled and canceled. And now he's a negative 500 favorite. So people are just over De Silva, even though that rematch hasn't happened yet. They're just hammering Charez.
All right, moving on. Next, we have another matchup with guys with less than 4 fights. In fact, they both have 2 fights under their belt. It is Mateus Mendonca and Jesus Aguilar. Aguilar with the incredibly high honor of scoring 1 DraftKings point and then 126 DraftKings points in back-to-back fights. So, Jake, are either one of these guys good or bad? And is this a good or bad matchup for either?
I had kind of higher hopes for Mendonca coming into the UFC. And then after, it was kind of similar to the Dos Santos. Like, when he fought Basharat, he held his own. He didn't get finished. He lost. But it was like, okay, like, he's got potential. After the fight, Basharat's like hyping him up. He's like, man, this guy's really good. Yeah. That's why I didn't finish him, because this guy's really good. Like, okay, like, in hindsight, maybe that was just Basharat trying to make it look like a better win than it was. But I was kind of shocked that Mendonca dropped down to 125 after that. Like, you had your whole career at 135. You lose your debut at 135 to a really tough opponent, and then you drop down to 125, and then you just fight like an idiot and go for a leg lock for like 3 straight minutes while Nate Maness pounds you out on the mat. And it's like, okay, Mendonca probably translates to donkey in Portuguese, because this guy's a complete idiot, and he's just sitting there getting his head pounded in. So we can't trust him anymore. I mean, the face tat probably should have been a dead giveaway that he's not the brightest guy. And now he's going against a one-dimensional guillotine specialist. And most people that would fight a one-dimensional specialist, yeah, okay, just don't fall into that one trap. I don't trust Mendonca not to get guillotined here, man. The guy leaves his neck open. He's shot for 14 takedown attempts so far in less than 4 rounds of action. And it seems like his neck's open on a lot of those. And Jesus Aguilar will go for a guillotine at every possible opportunity. So I think there's a good chance that Mendonca gets subbed here. So from I've been talking about him, but from Aguilar's perspective, it's probably a good matchup just because he's going against an idiot who's going to leave his neck out. And from Duncan's perspective, it's actually a good matchup too because he's going against another idiot who's going to go for a guillotine at every opportunity. So if Aguilar doesn't get the guillotine, he's going to end up on his back, and Duncan's going to have top position and going to be able to probably hang out there, maybe even get a submission of his own. Basically, all of Aguilar's fights either go the distance or end in submission. So I think both guys are bad, but I think it's a good matchup for each of them, man. I think it's either guillotine for Aguilar or else Mendonca finds success with his wrestling.
What a sick card we have here. All right, next we have Christian Quinones against Barcelos, who we talked about earlier. Quinones, kind of similar to Aguilar, 98 points in his debut, 5 points in his second fight. So is he good or bad? Is this a good or bad matchup against Ione Barcelos?
So I thought Quinones was bad coming into his UFC debut, and then he gets the quick stoppage, round 1 TKO win. And it's like, okay, maybe he's okay. He didn't look terrible. And then he immediately gets finished in his second fight. Looks terrible there. He was kind of pushing hard for a finish, gets caught, almost knocked out, and then he immediately gets subbed. You're like, okay, he doesn't know how to defend a submission attempt, but he was also half knocked out there. His brother's terrible, Jose Quinones, who I think he went 5-4 in the UFC. Honestly, was fortunate to do that well. I didn't think he was any good. Christian maybe a little bit better than his brother, but he's still not that great. He looks like a one-dimensional striker. Theoretically, this is a really tough matchup for him against Barcelos, but Barcelos is 1-4 in his last 5 fights and has looked terrible lately. I mean, he's almost 37 years old. Those lighter weight classes, they really don't age well. So it's hard to know if it's a good matchup because if Barcelos has completely gone off a cliff, I mean, maybe he gets caught, maybe he gets knocked out again. He got his first knockout loss 2 fights ago. He just hasn't been looking good. But I mean, theoretically, it's a bad matchup unless Barcelos is just completely washed up at this point, which is not impossible. But it's probably a bad fighter and a bad matchup, barring that.
I haven't asked for all of our viewers right now whether you take the time to pause this and go Google Christian Quinones, what he looks like, or you just wait until the fights start and you watch him. Comment below if you think he and Jake look alike. Obviously, tats aside. If you think those two look alike, comment below. Or tell me I'm crazy. Let me know. I see it. Jake, do you see it?
You're crazy.
Okay. We'll see. Viewers, let me know. If I'm completely crazy, let me know. But please, I hope one of you feel the same. All right. Sorry, Jake. All right, next, we have the mispriced fighter we talked about already, Manuel Torres. Yes, we're still not done with this segment. Manuel Torres, mispriced. He's against Chris Duncan. Are these guys good or bad? Is this a good or bad matchup for either?
Hold on, I'm Googling Christian Quinones.
Okay. I honestly think it's the haircut. I think it's the haircut more than most. But
well, DraftKings only has a picture of a flag for him, so never mind. I'm not actually Googling it. All right. So in terms of Torres and Duncan, I think Torres is a fraud, man. I mean, anytime you get a guy who's only been out of the first round once in his career, it's typically not because he's the best fighter of all time. It's typically because he's a fraud who's been facing a bunch of terrible competition, which is the case with Torres. He hasn't fought anybody. He never gets out of the first round. He barely gets past like the 3 or 4 minute mark. If he does, I think he's going to completely gas out. And obviously, the fact that he's only been passed once in his career makes it hard to know that. But if you go back to his debut, he was already getting tired late in the first round of that fight. No one has really made him work. I think this guy is going to get like really badly exposed. And whether it's here in his next fight, I think it's going to be here. But I feel confident in that read. Even if he gets a knockout here, I still think he's a fraud. And I'll still be saying the same thing in his next fight. But I don't think he gets a knockout here. I think this is a bad matchup for him. I think everyone's going to look at Duncan's Contender Series fights and think it's a great matchup for Torres and not put enough value into his 2 UFC fights where he's been, training at AT&T. He's been working on his wrestling. He's been working with Grant Dawson and Poirier. He's gotten a lot better. He's not fighting like an idiot anymore. And he's actually like being more of a tactician. And he just fought Yanal Ashamus, who's basically the same thing as Torres, just a one-dimensional power puncher who's trying to get a bunch of round 1 knockouts. And Duncan showed he could stay safe in that fight. And I know Yanel broke his wrist like in the first round, but still, I mean, I still think he showed at least in the first round and at least I would say after that, but whatever. Even if you only want to factor in the first round, he still showed he could avoid taking that big damage now. He's fighting smarter, and I think he can wrestle. We've seen Torres struggle on the mat. He's been submitted a couple times. He will go for guillotines, which I think is the one thing Duncan needs to watch out for, other than the big punches, is just don't get guillotined on your entries. And I think he can wear Torres out really pretty easily here. I don't think Duncan's great or anything. I think this is an absolutely dream matchup for Duncan. Torres is going to be the highest owned fighter on the card. He's a if you ask me, I mean, it's speculative, but I think he's a complete gasser. So it's like, do you want to play the guy with a 3-minute gas tank who's going to be 43% owned, who's never faced any legitimate competition? Or do you want to play the other side who's sub 20% owned, who has won decisions in both of his UFC fights, who can win a long fight, he can knock you out, he can wrestle. And even if Duncan's only mediocre, I think mediocre is enough to capitalize on Torres here.
Well, when you put it that way, seems like the decision is pretty easy in tournaments. So thank you for that analysis, Jake. We are not done yet, and I'm going to have to fly through this because I think this video is going to be like 3 hours long if we do not. So Yasmin Harrigy, she's fighting Sam Hughes, Jake. Suffered her first defeat against Denise Gomes in her last fight. She's $9,500, most expensive fighter on the card. I can guarantee she will not be popular, given that she is a female fighter as the most expensive fighter on the card. Is she good or bad? Yes. Is this a good or bad matchup? Yes.
Yeah, man, she's good. It's a good matchup. And just look at the numbers, 33% implied chance for finish, and we have her projected at 17% owned. Like, it's not complicated.
Easy enough. Finally, we have, well, not even finally, still, we have Rosas Jr. and Ricky Tercios. Good or bad matchup for either? Are they good or bad?
I think they're both bad, man. I'm not sold on Rosas yet. I think he's a gasser. I think his striking is a work in progress. Yeah, he can grapple and wrestle, but if you can't go 3 hard rounds doing that, then you're going to be in trouble. And I don't think he's smart enough to realize that he doesn't have the cardio to do that. So he comes out of every fight just completely, out of the gates firing. And when he doesn't get finishes, I think he's going to continue to gas. Like, he gassed out against, Christian Rodriguez. And then the next fight, he immediately comes out of the gates like blazing hot again. And yeah, he finished Terrence Mitchell. But Terrence Mitchell's like the worst fighter on earth. So people are going to overvalue Rosas now. Ricky Tercios is really tough. Terrible wrestling for Tercios, though. So, yeah, Rosas may be able to rack up a ton of takedowns, but then is he going to gas out midway through round 2 again? So that's why he's a bad fighter. It's a good matchup for him because, yeah, Tercios has completely terrible wrestling. Tercios just wants to strike and go for submissions. He hasn't even tried to defend takedowns, really. And then another side of thing, I think because Rosas has bad cardio and Tercios, that's what he excels at, is pushing a pace and weaponizing his cardio and constantly landing strikes. I think it's a good matchup for him because if you can go against a guy that's gassing, you can take over in the back half of the fight, and you can do it enough in a round and a half to score well and win a fight. You don't even need 3 rounds if one of the guys is completely gassed out. So I think they're both bad fighters, but I think it's a really good matchup for each of them, and whoever wins should score well.
Like that a lot. And this will not shock you, but we are not done yet, but we're close to done. Daniel Zellhuber, Francisco Prado, both of these guys, are they good or bad? Is this a good or bad matchup for either?
I think Zellhuber is good, but I do think it's a bad matchup. I think Prado is a tough fighter. I don't know if Prado's necessarily good. He's kind of undersized. He's a little bit stocky, shorter arms. So I think he's going to have trouble finding his range here. So I think Zellhuber is going to have to stay on the outside and strike, just based on the stylistic matchup, which is bad for DFS. So I think it's a good fighter and a bad matchup for him. And I think Prado, it's a really tough matchup. I mean, I'm not even going to call Prado good. He's high upside, but I think it's a bad matchup for him.
All right, that'll do it for that segment. It was very long. So we have 3 final segments to talk about, and these will be brief. It'll be the underdog stat of the week. It will be the fight that you have to target in DFS, and it'll be our stream parlay for the video. A couple questions that you may have as you're watching this video. If you just only watch the videos, you may ask, how else can I support you guys? I appreciate your videos every week. How can I support you? 2 quick ways. You can subscribe to the channel. You become a member of the channel. Member of the channel is just $2.99 a month. That gets you access to our Discord server where you can chat with us, sweat the fights out with us, get some other perks if you play other sports. Subscribing, you get access to let you know when all of our videos are posted here on YouTube. We do these UFC videos every Friday or Saturday. Subscribing is the best way to get notified whenever the video goes live. The other question you may have is, all right, I love this. Where can I get some more information? Check out Jake's site, MMA DFS.com. Check out our site, OccupyFantasy.com, where you can get write-ups, bets, models, tools to build lineups, everything you need for that extra edge for UFC DFS. All the links for that is in the description below. So Jake, Underdog Fantasy, for those of you who have not signed up, use promo code OCCUPY to get a 100% deposit match bonus up to $100. So free $100. If you deposit $100, you can use that on some stats, some pick'ems. So Jake, which Underdog Fantasy stat stands out to you this week?
Yeah, I like Brandon Moreno over 69.5 significant strikes. I think we're going to see a high volume fight, and maybe he wrestles a ton, but I think he'll be trying to put on at least some sort of show in front of the home crowd. And I think Royval's pretty hittable, so I like Moreno to put up a good striking total here.
It feels like the only way that loses, well, really jinxed it now, but is with an early finish, right?
Right.
Okay. All right. Next, we have our fight you have to target in DFS, and there's quite a few options this week, given the volatility of a lot of these fighters, Jake. But if you had to nail it down to one, to whoever wins is likely to be in the optimal lineup on DraftKings, which fight would you pick?
Yeah, there are a lot of options. I'm going to go with the Felipe dos Santos and Victor Altamirano fight. There are definitely some ways that dos Santos could win and get left out, but overall, I think both guys are in a high upside spot and a high floor too. So I think in all contest types, both guys are interesting.
That's a great transition to our stream parlay of the week, where Altamirano actually ranks higher in our Occupy model than Dos Santos, which is something we always take note of. Those fighters that rank higher as an underdog have a much higher win probability than their odds suggest historically. In fact, the only underdog to rank higher last week was Taporia. Sorry, Jake. So Altamirano is actually the cover boy of our daily plug this week. I got to go with that. I got to ride with this. So I'll say Altamirano money line is my side of the stream parlay. Jake, what do you got? What are you pairing it with?
I just want to point out with the whole Volk thing that I nailed every other outcome on the main card to the exact method and round, and then Volk happened, and it was just a mess.
The people
but
will not stand for it.
It happens. They will not. All right. Well, if you're going Altamirano money line, I'm going to give us a nice juicy parlay here. I'm going to go Duncan round 2 win at plus 850 to get us to plus 3130. If you want a safer version, obviously, Duncan money line, Duncan inside the distance, Duncan knockout, Duncan round 1 or round 2. But I like round 2, man. I think Torres gasses out. I think Duncan for a round 2 finish at plus 850 compared to his money line, which is, I got it at plus 165. I saw a little bit of pushback today. It was down to like 152 at the place I looked. Plus 850 compared to that, man. I really think round 2 is probably the most likely time he gets a finish after Torres gasses out. Maybe it comes late round 1. Maybe he just lays on him for 3 rounds. Who knows? But I think round 2 at plus 850, man. I like it. And at 31 to 1, I think that's pretty solid.
Love that. Let's see if we can hit that. All right, guys, that'll do it for this video. Again, comment below with Jake and Christian Canonia's comparisons. Tell me I'm crazy or if you think it's right. Also, last week we talked about a lot of bias in fighters, right? I talked about Taporia, and Jake and I were discussing that a little bit. So comment below if there's a fighter on this card that you're biased towards or against, right? Get it out in the open, right? And let us know which fighter has a little bit of bias in your mind. That way we can try to avoid that bias for our DFS lineups or even our bets. Jake, do you have anyone on this card? I forgot to ask you. Are you biased? I feel like you're biased against Moreno, but I feel like maybe you've come around on that too. Am I wrong there?
I've never been a huge Moreno fan. I'm normally looking to fade him in DFS. So the fact that I'm on him here probably says he's a really good play. But I mean, my biggest bias has to be Manuel Torres, just because I've been saying he's a fraud for a while. So when Manuel Torres completely ruins the slate by scoring 135 points in a 30-second knockout, I'll be drinking my sorrows away.
All right, guys. It's been a long video. We appreciate you staying through all the way to the end. You can follow Jake on Twitter at DFS_MMA. I am at Brian Jesser FF, also at Occupy Fantasy. Go to our sites, MMADFS.com and OccupyFantasy.com for, I would say, best in the industry betting and DFS tips for the UFC. So thanks for listening and good luck at UFC Mexico.